Hey, Eric, thanks for joining me today. It's great to be with you. We talk a lot, don't we, about culture change? But in your experience, what does a FinOps culture look like?
Well, let me tell a little story about how culture comes to be. So traditionally, at least from my expertise, when you operate in an old environment where you have a bunch of, I'll call it pets, running in a more or less an infrastructure as a service hosting provider, you don't really pay much attention to cost and usage because really, you're developing on your own machines and you're just running production services and maybe a production like environment. That's old school mentality, right? You're buying storage arrays through that vendor, you're buying network gear through the vendor, and they're managing that infrastructure for you, at least from my experience. Now, when you go to the cloud, that all becomes your responsibility. And because you are now responsible for the infrastructure, whether you like it or not, you're also responsible for the cost of that infrastructure and how it's running. So you need to start thinking about, number one, the visibility, right? Understanding where you're using those resources, who's using those resources, what is being used, is it needed, is it idle, does it need to be destroyed, did you leave that DR environment on again after you went through the DR test that attributed to hundreds of thousands of dollars, for example. But it really starts with the visibility. And then from a culture perspective, once you have that visibility, you can start finding your allies within the organization to start building infrastructure in the right way, to start. And what I mean by that is, having auto scaling so you can start growing and shrinking, using managed services where applicable to get yourself out of having to worry about patching systems and responding to alerts when something on the infrastructure fails. For me personally, this was part of our journey that we went through at Boomi. And what I can definitely share is I created a persona called the Grinch in partnership with Joe Daly. Joe and I were brainstorming a while back about how Nationwide was able to leverage the Grinch, and they created a story around holiday time right now, which more or less you basically have the Grinch looking after your resources, and the Grinch is watching out for those idle resources, and then actually being able to show the impact of what we did by turning off all these resources during the holiday, and from a dollar figure. And for us, we were able to save hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of a couple of weeks compared to last year. So it was phenomenal. After that point, it just stuck. I became known as the Grinch. The persona stuck. So I kept playing the Grinch and then helping people understand their usage, and then building dashboards with them to understand where their usage is going, and establishing budgets with them together, as opposed to just establishing, saying, hey, this is your budget and you're stuck to this line here. So it became more of
Let
like
me
a partnership. And
let me leap in there, Eric, and
please.
sort of see if we can pick away at some of that. The first thing you were talking about was the difference between when a cost matters to you, and before then it didn't matter to you. So it's a question of, the first thing with culture is this idea of you own it, you're accountable for the cost of it, you're accountable for delivering value from it. Is that in your view the first step in a culture change, this establishment of ownership and accountability?
Accountability is one. You need the visibility before the accountability. But what I did to start off this whole process is I took a roadshow. I made a roadshow with all of our engineers. I literally met with every single engineer in each team, and we've got about 20 different teams. So it was a lot of talking and giving the same presentation over and over again. But my whole goal to touch each engineer individually was to kind of break it down to their level and show them that I'm not here to like watch the budget, right? I'm here to work with you to understand your usage and how to make it more efficient. So what it boiled down to was breaking it down to something that we could all relate to. So let's think about the power situation of your house, right? When you walk outside of your house and you go to work for the day, at least in the old days, do you turn off your lights or do you leave them on? And then, most people would answer, oh, we turn them off. So you can apply the same context to AWS resources. Are you using these resources 24/7, or do you need them 8 to 5 during normal business hours? And most of the time it's like, oh, well, we don't need them all the time. So I said, guess what? You can turn it off and not have to pay for it. No, by the way, here's a mechanism to have it automated. So you can have it automatically shut off and then come back on a timer. So that picked up adoption pretty quickly.
Would you say that that was sort of an education process then? You go around these engineers and you have a one-on-one session, you educate them as to why this is important, how it can be done, you maybe show them how it's done, and you then encourage them to do it themselves. Is that the way it works?
That's right. It was education. It was bringing myself down to their level, finding something that they could relate to at the end of the day, just being power. Or I also used an analogy of, that leaky faucet that you have outside, right? Do you want to do something about it, or do you want to keep letting it leak at the end of the day? And that one picked up some steam as well. It's just really basic scenarios that they can relate to. And I'm good at talking with people. So understanding what their pain points are, understanding what they're looking for, as opposed to just talking at them. How can I help you become more efficient is more or less what I turned it into.
Right. So it sounds very much like in your experience, or at least when you're doing it, the culture change is largely driven by you as a person evangelizing FinOps, getting out there, getting one-on-one situations and explaining it to people, helping them to develop an awareness of cost and value and showing them how they can then implement this change. And I guess over time, that sort of snowballs. Is that the way it works?
It's right. Like you have a top-down approach or a bottoms-up approach. And in my case, what worked well for me was a bottoms-up approach. Evangelizing it, spotlighting people who made efforts to make improvements to their infrastructure, making it 20% more efficient, for example. And I would do that in a positive way. I'd call people out we use Slack. So I would do it in Slack. I would do it in all hands. I would do it in terms of rewards. We have had these little points systems that we could send out. So I would send somebody, like a couple $100 if they made a really big improvement. We didn't have anything like standardized from a savings perspective, equates to a certain prize. But at the end of the day, I was just making efforts to reward people for the good work that they did and make sure that they're called out. And in our executive leadership meetings, I would always make these call outs saying team A made themselves more efficient by achieving X, Y, and Z. So doing that is positive towards the engineer. It's not hitting them with the stick saying that they're inefficient and you should be doing something different. It makes it, a joint venture, a partnership together. And that seemed to stick here at Boomi.
Cool. That sounds great. Do you have a specific story maybe, or some particular team you might have worked with that sticks in your mind as a great example of culture change?
Definitely. I would say the team that I'm going to pick on is a team that was we use a lot of Elasticsearch within our environment. And this team is the architecture team, more or less. So we have our platform, they focus on the architecture of the platform. And working with a woman, she actually just retired, so I was very sad to see her go, but she's done a lot of work. She would always look out for opportunities in making ourselves more efficient by either right-sizing resources or looking at different ways that we could make ourselves more efficient from a different technology perspective. So she was the sole driver in getting us to a managed service that cost us 80% less than our physical our infrastructure on EC2, and it was a managed service. So no longer did they have to manage the patches, no longer did they have to upgrade the versions or respond to alerts because they received an alert in the middle of the night. That became an AWS problem. And yep, sure, typically you would think that managed services are actually a little bit more expensive, but in this case, it became 80% cheaper because we had to use really big instance sizes with dedicated storage on them. And it was a slam dunk to move to the managed service, and we've never looked back. It's been game changing for us. And now they can focus on adding that business value versus operationally patching systems and responding to alerts, so on and so forth. That team has done wonders. They've really made us much more efficient. They own the stack and the configurations for all of our platform, and we have many platforms, and they've made every effort to right size as much as they possibly can in many platforms to save us money. So we're not, overly speccing our dev systems.
Right. Well, that sounds great. And, if we think about culture change as behavior change, in your experience, how much of that behavior change is driven by what you might think of as encouragement, incentives, education, support, and how much of the behavior change is down to governance and policy and channeling people's behavior with guardrails and so on to keep them on the straight and narrow? Do you use both tactics, and how do you balance those off?
Yeah, I'll start with governance. Governance is important to make sure that we're all following the same processes and policies which we've defined here. But more or less, like when we think of development resources, we're very EC2 centric here. So we thought at the very beginning, as we were developing our automated platform for non-production environments, to have it be able to have the capability to shut down on a time, on nights and weekends. And what we did was, from the very beginning, have these stacks set to timers. So they're going to pause everything, they're going to resume everything on nights and weekends. And just by establishing that cadence and having it automated, all engineers have only known that, right? They know that, oh, hey, we can set our stuff to turn off on nights and weekends, and we don't have to pay for those resources, with the exception of, elastic block storage and all that. So that's how governance has at least helped us at Boomi from the beginning. Now, from rewarding, as I mentioned before, and for calling people out from a culture perspective, that's been very effective to make sure that people get their to get their cred, I guess I'll say, for going above and beyond to make sure that we are properly sizing our resources in every environment. As I said, I don't hit people over the stick, or hit people with a stick over the head as a lessons learned. I did try that activity once before, more or less when we were going through a hard time a few years ago, and I knew that there was a bunch of resources online at night. So I started making threats that these resources were going to be, powered off, in the coming weeks. And that did not go over well with the engineers whatsoever. So I had to turn that statement around and ask them about, do you need these resources? Is there anything we can do together to make sure these resources are being turned off? And that changed the narrative quite a bit. So my lesson learned opportunity was that don't be the person smacking people, right? Not in this culture. And there could be other cultures where that's needed, but I have not encountered it in my culture.
You know what? That's quite an interesting thing, because just before this call, I was looking on Slack, and there was a comment. Funnily enough, Joe Daly was in the thread, and it was about I can't remember exactly what the nature of the thread was, but the nature of the point the guy was making was about tagging completeness and whether 85% tagging completeness was okay. And so the conversation went on, and there was one comment that said, well, what we do is we threaten guys that if instances or resources are improperly tagged, we'll delete them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's obviously a rather stick-oriented tactic.
Definitely.
But perhaps it's a sort of tactic that will work in some organizations, but not others. And so perhaps what it says is you need to be alive to the culture in your own particular environment.
That's definitely right. Now, that approach can, as you said, can be very useful if your culture is brought up that way. However, I would probably choose a different approach to have a utility be the nag, as opposed to a person being the nag. So if you think about it, you can get very angry at a person, but you can't get as angry at a utility, a robot, more or less, that is spamming you that you're out of tagging compliance. Now, you would have to establish a governance and a policy first. And I would recommend working with your CCOE or your engineers to make sure that there is a tagging standard set first. Give them the proper warning that, hey, this tool is going to be turned on and it's not going to remove your resources, but it's going to start nagging about resources that are untagged. Now, of course, if you don't have tags, you may not know who those resources belong to. So that's always a double-edged sword. But if you post a list somewhere and then nag the organization, as people start populating the information, you're going to be nagging less and less folks. But it can go either way.
I like the idea of getting the machine to do the nagging. I think that's a great idea. I think a lot of organizations got to pick up on that.
Right. If people don't scale as well as machines. If you can have something like cloud custodian, enforce the policies, that's going to give you infinite scale. Whereas and if I had a peer going and pulling a list and then opening tickets with each of the teams, that's just our time and effort. And as we keep adding more engineers and more teams, we're going to run out of resources. And I'd rather work on doing it smartly by automating as opposed to, adding people to be able to nag other people.
So Eric, as you look forward from where you are now, I mean, we're just at the end of 2021, we're looking into 2022. What, with culture change in mind, where are your FinOps efforts focused for 2022?
So for next year, where I'd like to go is to establish automated governance. Now, we don't have an automated governance right now outside of we have a central development environment that uses infrastructure as code. So for the most part, tags are incorporated with the infrastructure that are being built. But as we start scaling out and building new infrastructure and building new building containers, right? We're going to containerize. Then we need to make sure that we're doing it in the right way. So having myself involved in the architecture discussions is important, but also having the governance, a tool, a nagger that will start, pestering the engineers in terms of being out of compliance is where I'd like to go. And then two is more or less a waste dashboard. One thing or I'll say an inefficiency dashboard, as you and I know, waste is for resources that have no business value, period. But for inefficiency, collecting a number of metrics such as how many elastic block storage volumes are unattached and who does it belong to, right? So come up with like a scorecarding system automatically that will provide information into engineer Slack channels about how they are, where they were over the last week, giving them, and then what they can do, of course, to make themselves more efficient is where I'm heading. And the whole purpose there is to provide more information to engineers to make those informed decisions based upon data.
Eric, that's brilliant. I guess we should schedule a call for December 2022 so I can ask you how you got on with all that. But for now, thank you so much for joining
resources
me.
For that.
And you have a happy holiday and enjoy a break. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike, take care. It's nice to talk with you as always.
And you, Eric.